He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a surprised laugh, a real one, the kind that fills a room and expects the room to agree with it. My Uncle Dennis laughed when my grandfather cut me out of the will, and I stood there in that lawyer's office in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, holding a paper cup of water I had not taken a sip from, and I thought, remember this moment, because this is the last time you get to laugh at me. Welcome back to Ravage Stories, where secrets come out, betrayals get exposed, and the people who thought they'd get away with it never do. If you're new here, subscribe, join the family. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. Drop a comment where you are listening from. It means a lot to me. Now let's go. My name is Maya Harlan. I am 35 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom rental in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and until 14 months ago, I sewed my own curtains because I could not afford store-bought ones that I actually liked. I want you to know that detail. I sewed them from a remnant I found at the fabric store on Cedar Avenue, a gray linen with a thin ivory stripe. Cut and hemmed them myself on a Saturday afternoon with a cup of coffee going cold on the windowsill. They were good curtains. They are still hanging there. I tell you this because I want you to understand exactly who was in that lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning in March. Not someone who had ever belonged in a room like that. Someone who had driven 2 hours in a 2014 Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a heating system that works on the left side only, and who had ironed her jacket twice before leaving the house because she did not want anyone in that room to have a single reason to look down at her. She ironed it twice. That matters. My grandfather was Walter Harlan, born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, 1938, died this past February at 84. He built Harlan Hardware Supply from a single loading dock and a handshake loan from his brother-in-law into a regional distribution company with contracts across 6 states and annual revenue of $4.3 million. He did it with calloused hands and a 5 a.m. alarm clock and a stubbornness that everyone in the family described as difficult until the money made it look like vision. He was not a warm man. He was not an easy man. He was the kind of man who shows love by showing up. And if you did not understand that language, you would spend your whole life feeling unloved by him and be wrong about it. I understood it. My mother was his eldest, Margaret Harlan, née Decker. She came to this country from Poland at age 6, learned English in 8 months, put herself through community college while raising me alone after my father left when I was 3. She worked the front desk at a medical office for 22 years. She kept a small cactus on her windowsill named Gerald. She made pierogi from scratch every Christmas Eve because her mother had and her mother's mother had, and that thread mattered to her. She wore a silver chain around her neck with my father's wedding band on it, not because she missed him, because she said it reminded her that she had survived the thing she had been most afraid of. I never asked her to explain that further. Some things you understand without the explanation. She never remarried. She never complained. She went to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every single one of my volleyball games in a navy blouse she had owned since 1998 because it was the nicest thing she had, and she wanted to look right when she was proud of me. That blouse. I think about that blouse. My Uncle Dennis Harlan is 55 years old. He is my grandfather's only son, my mother's younger brother. He owns a bicycle retail shop in Allentown, Harlan Cycles, 6 locations, solid margins, the kind of business that runs well because the man who runs it is genuinely good at charming suppliers and genuinely better at charming himself. Dennis is handsome in the way that men who know they're handsome eventually become less handsome. Black hair, still thick, a little soft around the middle now, though he wears his suits well enough that you'd have to look twice to notice. He likes Tom Ford. He likes restaurants with wine lists that don't have prices. He likes being the most successful person in any room he happens to be standing in. He is divorced, no children. He does not think this is a relevant detail about himself. I have always thought it was the most relevant detail. The year I turned 12, Dennis came to my mother's apartment for Thanksgiving. He sat at our table, the fold-out one we kept in the closet and set up in the living room twice a year, and he looked around the apartment with a particular kind of smile. Not unkind exactly, just aware of what was missing. Aware of the difference between his life and ours. He said, "Margaret, you're still here." He meant the apartment. My mother said, "Still here, Dennis." She smiled. She touched the chain at her throat. She went back to the kitchen. I was 12 years old and I understood exactly what had just happened. My best friend is Caroline Oakes. She has been my best friend since the 7th grade, when we were assigned to the same table in science class, and she leaned over and whispered, "Your hypothesis is wrong, but your handwriting is incredible." We have been inseparable since. Caroline teaches 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary in Scranton. She has a classroom with a reading corner she built herself from milk crates and a remnant of the same carpet she found at the same fabric store I found my curtain linen at. We have joked about this for years. 2 women, 1 fabric store, 2 very different projects. She is 5'2" and she will argue with anyone. She will argue with a parking meter. She will argue with a weather forecast. She has also spent the better part of a year arguing with systems, institutions, and my own fear on my behalf. I would not be here without her. I need you to know that before we go any further. I knit. I crochet. I can fix a leaky faucet and rewire a lamp, and I once reupholstered a thrift store armchair so well that 3 different people asked me where I had bought it. I do things with my hands, not because I had to learn, because it calms me. When things get difficult, I make something. When the problem gets too large for my head, I put it in my hands instead. That matters later. The call came on a Thursday evening in November. I was sitting at my kitchen table knitting a pair of socks, charcoal gray, ribbed cuff, when my mother called. She sounded different, not upset, careful. Maya, your grandfather wants to meet with us, both of us, next week. I set down my needles, both of us, why? She paused the way she pauses when she already knows the answer but doesn't want to be the one to say it first. He wants to talk about the business, about what happens after. After. That one word. I held it. I'll be there. Walter Harlan's house was in a suburb of Harrisburg, a wide corner lot with a maple tree in the front that he had planted the year my mother was born. He was sitting in the living room when we arrived, smaller than I remembered, the way people get smaller when their body starts the work of letting go. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You have your mother's hands." I said, "I know." He nodded, like that settled something. Dennis was already there. He had driven up from Allentown, which was 2 hours, which meant he had driven up the night before and slept in the guest room, which meant this meeting had been scheduled long enough in advance that Dennis had time to make himself comfortable in it. I noticed that. I filed it. My grandfather talked for 40 minutes. He talked about the business. He talked about what he had built. He talked about what he wanted to happen to it. The short version is this. Harlan Hardware Supply was to be divided equally, 50% to Dennis, 50% to my mother. The house, the investment accounts, the liquid assets, split 3 ways between Dennis, my mother, and me. It was not a small estate, and Dennis sat across from me in my grandfather's living room, with his ankle crossed over his knee and his Tom Ford suit jacket sitting perfectly, and he looked at me the way people look at something they have already decided to take. I did not yet know that he had already spoken to my grandfather's attorney, 3 times, in the previous 6 weeks, without telling anyone. I found that out later. My grandfather died on a Saturday in February. He died at home, in his own bed, which is what he had wanted. My mother held his hand. I stood in the doorway of that room and I watched her hold his hand, and I thought about the fold-out table, about the navy blouse, about the 22 years at the front desk and the curtains she never complained she couldn't afford. She touched the chain at her throat, once, just once, then she let go. The reading of the will was 3 weeks later. The attorney's name was Richard Holt. He had a conference room on the 4th floor of a building on Market Street in Harrisburg. He had a glass pitcher of water on the table and paper cups stacked beside it. Dennis arrived in a charcoal suit. He brought his own attorney. I noted that. My mother sat beside me. She had worn the navy blouse. Holt opened the folder, and what he read was not what my grandfather had told us in November. The business, Harlan Hardware Supply, had been restructured. 3 months before my grandfather died, he had signed documents transferring 60% of the company into a holding LLC, WH Holdings, registered in Delaware, of which Dennis was the sole managing member. The remaining 40% went to my mother. My share of the liquid estate, the cash, the investment accounts, had been reduced from 1/3 to 8%. My grandfather's signature was on every page. I sat very still. I picked up the paper cup of water in front of me. I did not drink from it. I held it. Dennis looked at me from across the table, and he laughed, not loudly, not cruelly even, just a real laugh, the kind that's comfortable, the kind that expects no consequences. He said, "You know, Maya, your grandfather loved you. He just understood that some people are better suited to certain things than others." I set the cup down. I looked at him. I said nothing. My mother's hand found my arm under the table. I felt her fingers on my jacket sleeve. The jacket I had ironed twice. I said nothing, but I looked at Dennis Harlan and I thought, remember this. You just made the only mistake you were ever going to get to make. We drove back to Scranton in my Civic. My mother was quiet for an hour. Then she said, "He didn't mean it badly, Dennis. He's always thought he knew best about the business." I kept my eyes on the road. "Mom, I know," she said. "I know what you're going to say." I didn't say it. She touched the chain, left it there. I drove. I called Caroline from the parking lot of a gas station outside Hazleton. I told her everything. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "How much did they move?" I told her the numbers. Another 4 seconds. "Maya, that's not grief, that's a plan." That's what I thought. "How old were the documents?" 3 months before he died. So, November. She said, "That's when you had the meeting, at the house." Yes. She said, "Maya, he was in that room with you, watching your grandfather tell you what he was planning to leave you, and he already knew it wasn't going to happen." The paper cup. I thought about the paper cup, the way I had held it and not drunk from it. I said, "I need a lawyer." She said, "I already have 3 names. I've been holding them for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I said, "You knew something was wrong?" She said, "I noticed Dennis was very calm at your grandfather's funeral. People who are grieving don't stand that still." Caroline Oakes, 4th grade teacher, Lincoln Elementary, Scranton, Pennsylvania. The most dangerous person I have ever known. The attorney Caroline found was named Patricia Lim. She worked out of a small office in downtown Scranton, 2nd floor of a building that used to be a haberdashery, which I know because the original sign is still faintly visible in the brick above the door. She had a desk covered in folders and a plant that had clearly been thriving for many years without anyone's help. She shook my hand. She looked at the documents I had brought. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Walk me through November. Everything your grandfather said. Everything Dennis said. What time you arrived, where everyone was sitting, who spoke first." So I did. She took notes. She stopped me twice to ask for specific wording. She made me repeat 3 things a second time. At the end, she said, "The LLC structure is the issue. WH Holdings was registered in Delaware in October. Your grandfather signed the transfer documents in November. He died in February." She paused. How was his cognitive health in those last months? I thought about the November meeting, about how he had looked at me. He knew who I was. He was sharp. She nodded slowly. "That makes it harder, but not impossible. It depends on what happened in those 6 weeks, between October and November, between the LLC registration and the family meeting where he told you one thing while the documents already said another." She closed the folder. "I want to know who initiated the LLC filing, who drafted it, who introduced Dennis to the structure. Was it your grandfather's idea, or was it presented to him?" I said, "How do we find that out?" She said, "We ask. And when the asking stops working, we subpoena." Here is what Patricia Lim found. I am going to tell you this the way it unfolded. Not all at once, because that is not how it unfolded. It came in pieces, the way these things always do. Each piece small enough to explain away on its own. All of them together, not explainable at all. The first piece, WH Holdings LLC, was registered in Delaware on October 7th. The registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington. The drafting attorney was not Richard Holt, my grandfather's longtime estate attorney. It was a different firm entirely, one that Dennis had used before for the Allentown expansion of his bicycle business. My grandfather had never worked with that firm in his life. Patricia flagged this. "Your grandfather had a 30-year relationship with Holt. He used Holt for everything. His will, his business structure, his property transfers. Why would he suddenly use Dennis's firm for the most significant restructuring of his estate 3 months before he died?" I said, "He wouldn't." She said, "That's what I think too." The second piece, Richard Holt, when Patricia contacted him, was cooperative, more cooperative than expected. He told her, "Walter came to me in September. He told me he wanted to restructure. He said Dennis had explained a strategy that would reduce estate tax exposure." Patricia asked, "Did Walter initiate that conversation, or did Dennis bring him in?" Holt was quiet. Then, "Dennis made the appointment. He brought Walter." Patricia said, "So Dennis brought his father to your office to tell you that his father wanted a restructuring based on a strategy Dennis had explained to him." Holt, "That is accurate." Patricia, "And then the actual documents were drafted by Dennis's firm, not yours." A longer pause. I should have flagged that. At the time, I accepted that Walter wanted a second firm involved for independence. Patricia, "Did Walter tell you that himself, or did Dennis convey it?" The longest pause yet. Patricia Lim told me about this conversation on a Wednesday afternoon while I was sitting in her office holding a skein of yarn I had brought in my bag without meaning to bring it. I had been turning it over and over in my hands while she talked. She looked at the yarn. She looked at me. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Keep going." She said, "Holt has agreed to provide a full statement. He believes he was used as a credibility anchor, a familiar face in a meeting designed to make Walter feel like he was getting independent advice when he was actually getting Dennis's script." I set the yarn down on my knee. I said, "My grandfather was 83 years old. He was not confused, but he trusted his son." She said, "Yes." I said, "He trusted his son, and his son used that against him." She said, "That is what the evidence suggests." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "What do we do with it?" She said, "We build the case, and then we file." The third piece came from Caroline. This is the part I love about Caroline Oakes. She is a fourth-grade teacher. She decorates her classroom for every season. She has a bin of math manipulatives that she sorted by color on her own time. She is also the person who thought to search the Pennsylvania Business Registry for every entity Dennis Harlan had formed in the previous 5 years. She found 4 LLCs. One of them, DH Property Holdings, had been registered in 2021. Its listed assets included a parcel of land in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. She pulled the deed. The land had been transferred to DH Property Holdings in December, 1 month after my grandfather's restructuring meeting. The land had previously belonged to Walter Harlan personally. It was not in the will. It was not in the estate filing. It was in Dennis's LLC, transferred for a stated consideration of $1. I looked at the deed number on my phone screen for a long time. $1. A piece of land in Monroe County. $1. I sent it to Patricia. She called me within the hour. She said, "This changes the filing. This isn't just undue influence on the will. This is potentially a fraudulent transfer, possibly wire fraud, depending on how the transfer was documented and whether any of the communications crossed state lines." I said, "Federal?" She said, "Potentially. I'm going to make a call. I need to tell you about the fly, because you need to understand Dennis Harlan as a complete human being, not just a villain. He is a germaphobe. I mean a serious one. The kind where he carries his own pen because he will not use one that has been touched by someone else. The kind where he wipes the rim of his wine glass with a cocktail napkin before he drinks from it. In July, this was the summer before all of this, before the will, before the LLC, before any of it. The extended family had dinner at an outdoor restaurant in Allentown. A fly landed on the table, just landed, on the tablecloth, near the breadbasket. Dennis stood up, knocked his chair back, knocked it fully back. It hit the floor. He stood there looking at the table with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something catastrophic. He said, "I'm not eating here. I am never eating here again." His date at the time, a very patient woman named Karen, said, "Dennis, it's outside. There are flies outside." He said, "Not at my table." He paid the bill. We left. He has not been back. I tell you this because later, when things got very serious, I thought about that fly. I thought about a man who could not tolerate a fly on a tablecloth, but had no problem transferring his dying father's land for $1. Some people's boundaries are located in very strange places. Patricia Lim filed the challenge in April. Undue influence, lack of independent counsel, fraudulent transfer of real property. The filing was 47 pages. It had 23 exhibits. It included Richard Holt's statement. It included the Delaware LLC registration timeline. It included the Monroe County deed. It included phone records showing 14 calls between Dennis and the Wilmington law firm in the 3 weeks before my grandfather was brought to Holt's office. 14 calls, in 3 weeks, before my grandfather knew anything was happening. I held those call records in my hands the same way I had held the paper cup, carefully, without drinking from it. My mother found out about the filing on a Thursday evening. I told her myself. I drove to her apartment. I sat at her kitchen table, a real kitchen table, not the fold-out. She had bought one 3 years ago, and I told her everything. She listened. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "He's still my brother, Maya." I said, "I know." She said, I don't want him arrested. I don't want." She stopped. She touched the chain, held it. Her hands were shaking. I had never seen my mother's hands shake. In 35 years, I had never once seen her hands shake. She said, very quietly, "He was there when our father was dying. He sat with us. He held his hand." I said, "Mom." She said, I know what he did." She looked at the table. She said, He smiled at my father's funeral. I thought it was composure. I thought he was holding himself together. I said nothing. She looked up at me. She said, "He was already done, wasn't he? It was already settled. He had already, by the time we buried him." She stopped. She touched the chain, thumb running across the ring, once, twice, 3 times. She said, "My father worked his whole life. He got up at 5 a.m. for 40 years. He built something real." She stopped again. Then, "Okay, just that, okay." She put her hands flat on the table, steadied them, steadied herself. She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Nothing you don't want to give." She said, "Don't do that. Don't protect me. I'm your mother. What do you need?" I said, "A statement. About the November meeting, about what Grandpa told us, about what Dennis said." She nodded. She said, "Write down what you need. I'll sign it." I reached across the table. I put my hand over hers. She let me. For about 10 seconds, then she straightened up, put her shoulders back, said, "Do you want coffee? That's my mother. Do you want coffee?" The thing about Patricia Lim that I want you to understand is that she was not impressed by Dennis. She had seen Dennis types before. She had seen the suits and the charm and the ease with which certain men occupy rooms they did not build. She was not interested in that. She was interested in the 14 phone calls. She was interested in the $1 deed transfer. She was interested in the fact that a Delaware LLC had been structured by a Wilmington firm using language, specific language, that mirrored almost word for word the structure Dennis had used for his Allentown expansion. Same firm, same language, 2 different purposes, one legitimate, one not. She said to me once, early in the process, "The mistake people like Dennis make is that they think the money makes them untouchable. It doesn't. It makes them visible. Every dollar has a trail. Every transfer has a timestamp. Every phone call has a record." She said, "He got comfortable. Comfortable people make sloppy mistakes." She turned a page in her folder. She said, "The $1 deed transfer is the sloppiest mistake I have seen in 18 years of practice." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because it's greedy. He already had 60% of the business. He already had the restructured estate. He had won, and he still went back for the land." She looked at me. She said, "That's the kind of move you make when you believe no one is going to look." She closed the folder. She said, "We're looking." Patricia made her call. I did not ask who she called. I did not need to know yet. She told me, "There is interest at the federal level. The wire fraud question, whether the Delaware filing involved interstate communications in furtherance of the fraud, is something they want to look at." She said, "I want you to understand what this means. This is no longer just a civil challenge to the estate. If the federal interest materializes, it becomes a parallel track." I said, "What do I need to do?" She said, "Nothing you haven't already done. Keep your records. Don't contact Dennis. Don't let your mother contact Dennis. Don't discuss this with anyone outside this room and Caroline." I said, "Caroline already knows everything." She paused. Then, "Is she discreet?" I said, "She has kept every secret I have ever given her since 1999. Patricia, then she stays in. But no one else. I want to tell you about the folder. It started as a manila envelope, the kind you can buy in a pack of 10 at any office supply store. I put the original will documents in it, the November meeting notes I had written from memory the same night I got home, the LLC registration printout, the deed transfer. I kept it in my car, in the compartment under the passenger seat, not because I was hiding it, but because I did not want it in my apartment where I would look at it every day and let it take up more space than it deserved to take up. Over the following weeks, the envelope became a folder, then a full accordion file. It sat under the passenger seat. Every time I got in the car, I felt its presence. Not with dread, with something more like readiness. Here is something I have not told you yet. In the weeks between March and June, between the will reading and the federal inquiry, Dennis called my mother 4 times. I know this because she told me. Each time, she called me after each one. The calls were friendly, warm even. He asked how she was. He talked about his business. He mentioned once that he was planning to rebrand the Allentown flagship location. He never mentioned the estate. He never mentioned the LLC. He never mentioned me. My mother said, "He acts like nothing happened." I said, "I know." She said, "How do people do that?" I said, "Practice." She was quiet. Then, "Should I stop taking his calls?" I said, "That's your brother. That's your choice, not mine." She said, "Patricia says I shouldn't discuss the case." I said, "Then don't discuss the case. Talk about the weather. Talk about his bicycle shop. Talk about anything else." She said, "He asked about you." I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said you were fine, making things, keeping busy." I smiled at that. At my kitchen table, socks on the needles, I smiled. He said, "That's Maya, always with her little projects." He said little. I wrote that down. I do not know why. I just wrote it down. The deposition was scheduled for June 14th. Dennis arrived with 2 attorneys. He was wearing a navy suit, Tom Ford, I was almost certain, and he looked, if anything, more comfortable than he had at the will reading. He sat across the table from Patricia. He was charming. He was cooperative. He was the version of Dennis Harlan that had been charming suppliers and winning rooms for 30 years. Patricia let him be charming for about 20 minutes. She asked about his relationship with his father, about the business, about the November meeting. He answered everything smoothly. Then she placed the phone records on the table. She said, "Mr. Harlan, these records show 14 calls between your cell phone and the Wilmington office of Hargrove and Associates between September 19th and October 6th. He looked at the records. He said, "I may have been in contact with them. I used them for business matters." Patricia, these calls predate by 1 day the registration of WH Holdings LLC, the entity that received 60% of your father's business. He said, "I introduced my father to the structure. He liked it. He made his own decision." Patricia, did your father contact Hargrove and Associates directly at any point? A pause. He said, "I believe the communication was primarily through me." Patricia, all 14 calls were to your personal cell phone, not to your father's phone, not to Richard Holt's office. He said, "I was acting as a liaison." Patricia, over 14 calls, before your father was brought to Holt's office to express his desire for a restructuring that had already been structured. His attorneys conferred quietly. Dennis looked at the table. For the first time in the deposition, he looked at the table. Then he looked up. He said, "I was acting in my father's best interest." Patricia, and the deed to the Monroe County property, transferred to DH Property Holdings for a stated consideration of $1, was that also in your father's best interest? The room was quiet. Patricia placed the deed on the table. She placed beside it the DH Property Holdings registration, filed in 2021, 2 years before any of this began. She placed beside that a county tax assessment showing the Monroe County parcel valued at $287,000 for $1. Dennis looked at his attorneys. One of them leaned forward and said, "We'd like to take a short break." Patricia said, "Of course." She gathered her papers. She looked at me once, just once, a very small nod. I went to the women's room during the break. I stood at the sink. I ran cold water over my wrists. I do this when I am nervous. It grounds me. Caroline taught me this. And I looked at myself in the mirror. The jacket I was wearing was not the same jacket I had ironed twice in March. I had bought this one in May. Dark gray, well cut, from an actual store with the tag still in it when I found it on the hanger. I looked at myself. I thought about the fabric store on Cedar Avenue, the curtains, the remnant linen with the ivory stripe. I thought about my mother's navy blouse. I thought about the fold-out table at Thanksgiving and Dennis's smile and the particular quality of being seen as something small by someone who had decided your smallness was permanent. I dried my hands. I went back in. The federal inquiry became formal in August. I am not going to describe this in procedural detail because Patricia has asked me to be careful about what I say while certain things are still pending. What I can tell you is this. The wire fraud question, whether the interstate communications in furtherance of the transfer constituted a federal violation, was answered. The answer was yes, and the Monroe County deed, the $287,000 parcel transferred for $1, turned out to not be the only one. There was a second parcel, in Carbon County, transferred 8 months earlier. Same structure. Same $1 consideration. 2 parcels. Over $600,000 in real property. Transferred out of a dying man's estate while his family sat at a fold-out Thanksgiving table thinking everything was fine. I sat in Patricia's office when she told me about the second parcel, and I looked at the plant on her windowsill, the one that thrived without help, and I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, "What happens now?" She said, "The civil case proceeds. We are asking for the full reversal of the LLC transfer, restoration of the estate to its original structure, and return of both parcels." I said, "And the federal track?" She said, "That is not in my hands." She paused. She said, "But I will tell you this. The U.S. Attorney's Office in the Middle District of Pennsylvania does not open wire fraud inquiries and close them quietly. Harlan Hardware Supply had its annual shareholder meeting on the second Thursday of September. I want you to understand what I mean when I say shareholder meeting. This was not a Fortune 500 boardroom. This was a conference room in a distribution warehouse on the outskirts of Harrisburg. Folding chairs, a projector screen, a tray of sandwiches from the deli next door. The kind of room my grandfather had run his entire professional life. The kind of room he had built from a loading dock and a handshake loan. Under the restructured documents, WH Holdings held 60% of the company. My mother held 40%. Under the civil challenge Patricia had filed, the restructuring was being contested. Pending that outcome, the existing structure was in place. Dennis controlled the meeting. He had controlled it for 7 months. What he did not know, what he had not been told, was that 3 weeks earlier, my mother had signed a limited proxy, assigning her 40% voting rights to Patricia Lim's firm for the purposes of any shareholder action taken during the pendency of the litigation. He also did not know, because the information had not been served on him yet. It was served that morning, 2 hours before the meeting, that the civil court had issued a temporary restraining order on any further business decisions by WH Holdings, pending the outcome of the case. He walked in carrying a leather portfolio. He looked relaxed. I was already in the room. He stopped when he saw me. He said, "Maya, I didn't know you'd be here." I said, "I'm a party to the litigation. I have standing to be present." He looked at Patricia, who was sitting beside me, with the accordion file on the table. He looked at his 2 attorneys who had come in behind him. He looked back at me. He said, This isn't the place for this." I said, "I agree. That's why we filed in court." Patricia slid the TRO across the table. Dennis looked at it. He looked at his attorneys. He looked at the sandwich tray. There was a fly on the edge of the table. I am not making this up. A single fly, on the edge of the conference table, near the sandwich tray. Dennis saw it. He stepped back. 2 full steps, away from the table, away from the fly, away from Patricia, away from me. He was standing against the back wall when his attorney said, quietly, "Dennis, we need to step out." He looked at me one more time. I looked back. I did not smile. I did not say anything. But I thought about that Thanksgiving table, about the fold-out, about the blouse my mother had worn to every single thing that had ever mattered to her. I thought about the word little, always with her little projects. I thought about my grandfather's hands, calloused, strong, waking up at 5 a.m. for 40 years, and how those hands had trusted the wrong person. I thought about the curtains on my window, gray linen, ivory stripe, cut and hemmed on a Saturday afternoon. Good curtains, still there. I looked at my Uncle Dennis Harlan backed against the wall of his father's conference room, and I said, quietly, the way you say something you have been holding for a long time, I said, "Some people are better suited to certain things than others." He went still. He recognized his own words. Then his attorney took his arm and they walked out. The grandmother was at the shareholder meeting. I should have told you this earlier. I am telling you now. My grandfather's sister, Irina Harlan, 81 years old, the last of that generation, a woman who had survived a Polish winter on potatoes and sheer will, and relocated to Pennsylvania at age 19 and never once asked anyone to feel sorry for her. She had come to the meeting because she had come to every shareholder meeting for 30 years. Tradition, loyalty, the same reason she did everything. She had taken the elevator up with her small canvas bag and her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. In the elevator, her glass eye, she had lost the left one in an accident in 1987. Her glass eye came loose. The way she told it later, she sneezed. Just once, just a small sneeze, and the eye dropped. It hit the elevator floor, that particular hard click, bounced once and disappeared directly into the open canvas bag of the woman standing beside her, a woman named Sandra from accounting. Sandra did not notice. Irina looked at Sandra. Sandra was looking at her phone. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. Irina said, very calmly, the way she said everything, "Excuse me, dear. I believe my eye is in your purse." Sandra looked up, then down at her purse, then back at Irina. She said, "I'm sorry?" And Irina said, "My eye. It bounced in. If you could just..." Sandra reached into her bag. She found the eye. She held it out. There was a long pause in which Sandra appeared to be reconsidering several life decisions. Irina took it, cleaned it with a handkerchief, reinserted it. She said, "Thank you, dear. It happens more than you'd think." She walked into the conference room and sat down and opened her reading glasses and folded her hands and waited. I love Irina. I have always loved Irina. She has never been afraid of anything, including her own eye, because she has already lived through the thing she was most afraid of, and it turned out she survived it. Here is what the resolution looked like. It did not look like a movie. It did not look like a courtroom speech. It looked like paperwork, and waiting, and more paperwork. The civil case settled in November, 8 months after we filed. The terms: WH Holdings LLC was dissolved. The 60-40 business split was vacated. The company reverted to its pre-restructuring structure, 50% to my mother, 50% to the estate. The Monroe County parcel was returned. The Carbon County parcel was returned. My share of the liquid estate was restored to its original proportion. Dennis paid the legal fees, his and ours. His attorneys, the Wilmington firm, were separately sanctioned by the Delaware Bar for their role in structuring the transfer without disclosure to the affected beneficiaries. Their names are now in the professional disciplinary record. That is permanent. That does not go away. Richard Holt, who had cooperated fully, received no sanction. He retired that December. He sent my mother a card. She keeps it in the kitchen drawer. The federal matter. I said I would not go into procedural detail while things are still pending. What I can tell you, in January of this year, Dennis Harlan received a target letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Pennsylvania. A target letter means you are the focus of a federal grand jury investigation. It does not mean you have been charged. It means the clock has started. I am telling you this not to celebrate it. I am telling you this because the $1 deed transfer and the 14 phone calls and the 2 parcels of land taken from a dying man deserve to have a clock started on them. My grandfather got up at 5 a.m. for 40 years. He deserves a clock. My mother called me the morning after the settlement was signed. She said, "I want to go to the cemetery. Will you come with me?" I said yes. We went on a Saturday, November, so the maple by the corner of the lot had already dropped most of its leaves. The ground was soft. We stood at the stone for a while without speaking. My mother touched the chain at her throat, thumb over the ring, just resting there. Then she said, "He would have hated all of this. The lawyers, the filings, the whole production." I said, yes. She said, "He would have handled it himself, in a room, with a handshake or a very hard conversation." I said, "I know." She said, "But he's not here." So we did it our way. She looked at the stone. She said, "I think he would have been proud of you." I said, "I think he would have been proud of you." She looked at me. She said, "Don't make me cry." I did my hair. I did not make her cry, but it was close. Caroline came over that evening. She brought wine and the ingredients for pierogi because she had learned to make them from my mother years ago, and she said, "I feel like this is a pierogi night." We made pierogi, we drank the wine, we sat at my kitchen table under the curtains I had sewn from the remnant, and we didn't talk about the case for most of the evening. We talked about her class, about a student who had written a story about a dragon who was afraid of the dark. She said, "It was the best thing I've read in years. Not from a kid, from anyone." We talked about the fabric store on Cedar Avenue, which had recently closed, which felt like the end of something even though it was only a fabric store. We talked about everything except the thing we had spent a year talking about. At the end of the night, she put on her coat, she picked up her bag, she stood at the door, she said, "You know what the most impressive thing was?" I said, "The phone records?" She said, "No, the November notes, the ones you wrote the night of the meeting, before you even knew you'd need them." I said, "I just felt like something was wrong." She said, "You trusted your instinct. When everyone around you was explaining it away, you wrote it down." She put her hand on the doorframe. She said, "That's the thing, Maya. The whole year, you just kept writing it down." She left. I stood at the window for a while. The curtains, gray linen, ivory stripe. I thought, you make things with your hands because your hands know what to do when your head is too full to think. The curtains came back. The estate came back. The land came back. Things you build carefully in ordinary years hold up in the hard ones. What this year taught me. The people who underestimate you are handing you information. What they are telling you is exactly how they plan to move and where they expect no resistance. Pay attention. The laugh in the lawyer's office is not cruelty. It's a map. Greed is not patient. It takes the extra parcel. It takes the second piece when the first piece was already everything. It goes back. And when it goes back, that is when it makes the mistake that ends it. Watch for the second parcel. That's where they fall. The thing you make in ordinary time with ordinary hands is not small. It is preparation you did not know you were doing. The curtains, the notes, the hours at the table with the coffee going cold. None of it is small. Every ordinary thing was practice. Before I go, think of someone. A woman, your mother, your aunt, yourself. Someone who ironed the jacket twice, who wore the blouse to every single important thing, who worked the front desk for 22 years and made pierogi at Christmas and never once said, "Look what I am carrying for you." Does she know that if someone came for what she built, what she survived, you would know what to do? Not because you have the legal degree, not because you have the connections, because you were paying attention, because you wrote it down, because you would notice the attorney who was brought in instead of chosen, because you would see the phone records, because you know that the laugh in the lawyer's office is a map. Drop a comment. Tell me, would you have done the same? Or is there someone in your life right now who you have been almost paying attention to? Because the almost is where these things live. That is where they grow. If this story hit you somewhere real, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the person who needs to hear it. I'll see you soon.